Hi guys, so this is another installment of our Zoom workshop series, and today we're discussing carnivorous plants. Now this is the first time we have people in the store able to ask questions as well, so if you are online, feel free to type in questions in the response, but we'll be having people in the shop as well asking things about the plants we have on display for you today. So one of the reasons why we're trying to talk so much about carnivorous plants over orchids or some of these other plants is these guys have particular needs and wants that some of our other plants don't really require. They have, particular watering needs, particular dormancy periods, some of them, and they're not as hard to grow as you might think, but they do have their specific requirements. So we're going to be talking from everything about Venus flytraps, Nepenthes, Sarracenia, Pinguicula, Drosera, and we'll be going a little bit over all the different carnivorous plants that we both do carry and chop, and some of the ones we hope to carry and chop, but you might have just only seen online or read blogs on.
All right, hi, my name is Richard Schaffner, and we're going to go, like Maxim was saying, go over all this. So I'm thinking jump right in, and we can start with the most important thing with carnivorous plants is light. Especially when you get the Sarracenias, to get this beautiful coloration on these plants, sunlight is essential. Now, when you're growing them here in Sacramento, it can be hard to do because we have very harsh summers. However, unless you have a greenhouse, the sunlight requirement is still in place, and they do need to have the sunlight. So if you're growing them outdoors here in Sacramento, I would say at least good morning sun from about sunrise. If they go into the shade around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, that's fine. They will have a tendency to burn outdoors. It's just how our summers are here. They're very hot. There's no way around that. If you try to get them into a shaded area, you can actually end up killing the plant because the growth will become attenuated, it'll start to get elongated, it'll deform, and then if they're staying wet on top of that, you can lose them because they'll rot out. So a lot of things that I see that I've had people talk to me about is that they're worried about the heat and it's going to kill them. Putting them in the shade will kill them much quicker than the heat will. They're going to look rough. Winter is right around, well, fall goes in, they start to go dormant. So it's better to have the plant going through healthy. Springtime here in Sacramento is when they look their best. Again, like I said, unless you have a greenhouse, these are from out of Maxon's greenhouse and they're gorgeous. They're going to have a tendency to burn. Do not put them in the shade. They can take the sun. They'll look rough, but they'll take it. It's essential for them. It really is. And in respect to dormancy, it kind of ties in with that. Don't bring them indoors for the winter time. In fact, it's really not an indoor plant at all. Venus flytraps, any of these guys, they are really not good indoor plants. They're better off outdoors.
And yeah, one thing I'd like to touch base on the Sarracenias is Richard mentioned a little bit about how they look best in the spring. Now, from my growing conditions, and even I think in your backyard, so Sarracenia flavas, that's going to be the kind we have here on the left, you're usually going to see a much more dramatic spread of pitchers. So when you're looking for a really dominant spring pitchering plant, I would go down the route of the flavas. Now leucophyllus, like this guy right here, tend to pitcher a little bit more heavily in the fall. So now, yes, by around, I'd say, October, November, they start breaking into dormancy. Really but October and September, you should see a whole new flush of pitchers. Now, especially with the Sarracenia leucophyllus, you see that flush of pitchers, but you'll see even some pop up on your older plants as well.
If you look right here, as Max is saying, here we are in August, and look at these new pitchers that are coming up on this one. So this is leucophylla, or it's a leucophylla hybrid. Judith Hindle, which is also a leucophylla hybrid, you can start to see there are new pitchers that have been opening up on this. But yeah, like you were saying, the flavas usually tend to grow their best in the spring. The largest pitchers are always produced in the spring. The smaller ones will come up throughout the year until dormancy.
And one thing to be said about these plants, and I really want to stress the fact, is they do need a really strong dormancy period. I have killed these plants by keeping them in temperate conditions in a greenhouse, and they really need that cold snap. A lot of people don't believe this, but these plants actually can reemerge in the snow and complete ice. They grow in the Carolinas, that some are from Massachusetts. They do grow in colder climates. So what's nice about them compared to a lot of your indoor houseplants or the houseplants we carry here is these are a great outdoor temperate tolerant plant.
And hopefully, just really quick, if this will drive it home for anybody, there was 1 year I grew these here in Sacramento outdoors We had a freeze. I had the pots freeze solid. Solid. You could knock on them. It was like cement. There's nothing wrong with them. They can take it. Where they're used to, where they grow in the wild, they have ice storms back there and everything. Our freezing temperatures here are not going to hurt them, but they do need it. I agree with you on that totally. With the exception of the Nepenthes and Helium-4 and some of the more exotic varieties, Sarracenias, Venus flytraps, the temperate Droseras, some of the varieties, Pinguiculas, there are some that are here in Northern California, they have to have that dormancy period. If you take them out of that, you'll lose them. Eventually they'll die on you. So that is also very extremely important. That dormancy period must be respected.
So I guess in response to all the dormancy carnivorous plants, let's maybe talk a little bit about the flytraps, because as far as what we have on the table, the flytraps are the other plants that actually require a dormancy period. And I think you, Rich, had a story of what happened when you kept too many flytraps in a terrarium for too long.
I had a terrarium full, as a 5-gallon terrarium full of Venus flytraps, made a carpet in there. So I had this guy tell me, he goes, you can't do this. If you do that, you're going to end up killing them. I'm watching these things grow, turn red. It's October, November. They look fantastic. I'm like, what does this guy know? He's talking to somebody else. Within the second year of me doing that, these suddenly became deformed. They completely got long. There were they turned yellow. It was really bad. So what I ended up doing was taking the whole terrarium outside in the middle of winter, leaving it out there, and I still have those plants. Had I not done that, they would have gone to the wayside.
And the truth is, with the Sarracenia and the flytraps, you have a good 2-3 years, maybe shelf life inside. But after that second or third winter, you really need to consider, you need to put them outside.
And it's under optimal growing conditions too, so if they're getting chlorinated water, all those things, improper lighting, they're going to start going to that quicker. Now, what Maxon's saying, that's under optimum growing conditions. So if you're having them in low light, in chlorinated water, I give them probably a couple of months.
And I guess the next biggest thing that we really need to stress is the watering for these plants. Now, fortunately in Sacramento, the water isn't terrible. I'd still recommend going to DI or RO, reverse osmosis, or distilled water. That way you kind of remove all the chemicals. We have a lot of boron, we have a lot of salt, we have chlorine in our water, and all those chemicals are really abrasive to these plants' rhizomes and roots, and to the point where they aren't tolerant of it. They grow in very acidic conditions with very basic soil, peat and perlite, or peat and coarse sand. We'll talk a little bit about the medium in a little bit, but they really need water with no chemical additives. So we always say, especially if you're outside of Sacramento, really stress your water. And Brita filters, with Sacramento water, they're better, but you really want to see you really want to look for DI water or RO water for these.
Salt is the kiss of death to these plants. So when you're using tap water and all that, also the old myth that if you leave the water out, the chlorine dissipates. The chlorine is still there. The smell is what dissipates. So if you have really heavily chlorinated water, do not subscribe to that. I can leave this out for 24 hours and I can use it on the plants. The only thing is you're not smelling the chlorine, but the chlorine is still in the water. Chlorine, salt, all of that, it'll wipe them out. Where these grow in the wild, and we're going to get, like Maxon said, but to go back to this, they grow in peat. In the wild, they're in peat. There's no nutritional value on it. That's why these have evolved to become carnivorous. Peat, there's nothing in it. It's extremely acidic. What is it, like 3 on the pH scale or something like that? It's very high. They can take this. Regular potting soil, don't even think about it, especially with any of these plants. With plants like the Nepenthes and all those, you want to go with something like a chunkier aeroid mix, but with peat based. But with these guys, it's just, you really want to keep that in mind because it does make all the difference on how well they're going to do.
And same thing like the water, you use the wrong soil, same issue. If you're trying to try out a standard potting soil, you're going to have the same problem with etiolated growth. It's almost going to be like throwing another curveball at the plant. That's why, in a lot of these ways, these plants get these hard to grow reputation. It's just really, they have specific growth requirements. So that's a little bit about our Sarracenia, and that's a little bit about our flytraps. So I guess right now would be a good time, before we get into the more tropical plants, ask a few questions. So does anyone here in the store have any questions? Yes.
If we want to test whether our tap water or filtered water is okay. If we use those devices that measure like total dissolved solids, TDS, what does it not, is there anything that the TDS gauge not tell us? For example, is there still, can it detect the level of chlorine or anything else that might show a low TDS number but still has like water hardness, things like that?
That's a very good question. With that, you have to be careful with that. What I'd really recommend doing, if you're really going to go all out like that, I would have the water sent in and tested. I know that sounds extreme, but some of those test kits aren't going to have how much chlorine is in there, how much boron is in there, how much salt is in there. So basically where I live out in Carmichael, I use the tap water. It is safe to use when it's not treated. I had a situation before I went on vacation that they treated the water. I didn't know about it, and I lost a lot of plants from it. So it's one of those things, if it's questionable, if you have a big collection, you really are better off using an RO filter. Now, I know there's an issue with water waste on there, and I totally understand it, especially with what we're going through right now with the drought and everything. What I have done with that is that when I did have that on there, what I would do is use that water and water other plants with it, so nothing was going to waste. But you know, the smaller the collection, the easier it becomes. The larger the collection, as I have, the worse it becomes. But usually, if it's a small percentage of chlorine, if it's a small percentage of that, it won't hurt them. It really won't. But it's one of those things that if you smell your tap water and you're like going, this is, you know, it smells like a swimming pool, don't use it. Because again, if you leave that out like that, it's still, you just won't smell it, but the chemicals are still going to be on the water.
Unfortunately, if you are a Sacramento area resident, the water is much better here since it's sourced from the river, not well.
Exactly.
Do you have anyone asking questions in the Zoom chat, Jonathan?
No questions, Tom.
Well, in that case, we will move a little bit into the other category of carnivorous plants, the more tropical indoor to take care of. Now, I guess to tie back into the Sarracenia, these are not Sarracenia, but in the Sarracenia family. They are Helianthera. These are going to be the, as Rich corrected me earlier when I said Australian, the South American pitcher plants. And I know you said they are the
Helianthera. Now, what's amazing about this plant is that this was considered to be, on the evolutionary scale, this is what they determined, that this was the original form of the pitcher plant. That this is a nectar spoon, so the fly gets up into there and it secretes nectar. The other thing is where these grow at, are they tepui? Is that how you say it?
very high altitude.
Very high altitudes. They're up on the, they call them the cloud fort. It's way up in there. It's very cold. Water runs through there all the time. It rains constantly. What is amazing about this plant is it has adapted. Do you see how this tilts down right there? Anyone want to guess what that's for? So if the plant gets full of water, it spills out and does not lose any of the nutrient value in there. So if this becomes, when this gets rained on, it gets flooded, that's like a safety valve that lets the water out. Some of these have also evolved where this is like more like this, like the lid on the Sarracenias, which this is twofold. This also not only keeps the rain out, but it also acts as a landing platform and a feeding area. The nectar is strongest under here in the throat, and it's very slippery, and some of these even secrete, the Sarracenias, it's a flavonoid, I believe, and it's actually, it has a narcotic effect. So the bugs get drunk and they fall in. So going back to this is where these grow at, and there's some of these that they've actually found. There are bladderworts, which is also another carnivorous plant, literally jump from pitcher to pitcher in the wild up there, and they send their traps down in. So you have a twofold. You have carnivores living within carnivores. Plants after our own heart.
And unfortunately, we didn't really bring any bladderworts in. Maybe after this class we could post a picture in the chat of what a bladderwort is. It's this really interesting, small,
It's like a mouse trap.
carnivorous trap that usually, it's completely aquatic.
Yeah, and it's underwater, and it has a little, it's like a mouse trap. There's like a little swing door with trigger hairs on it, the same way the fly traps work. when a Daphnia or some kind of water creature hits it, it will suck it right into there, and the trap door shuts, it flushes the water out, keeps the bug in, then it secretes fluid, and it digests and eats it.
Pressure activated, which is a little interesting compared to the semi-stomatic activation on the fly traps. Now, yeah, Helianthus, they're, again, really beautiful plant. You know, you won't really see them anywhere other than the botanical gardens, since they aren't for the faint of heart. Even, you know, us carnivorous plant collectors don't keep them.
I won't touch these.
Because of their level of kind of difficulty. You know, they want, you know, it's usually easy to replicate heat and humidity. It's hard to replicate cooler humidity. And these, like some of the highland nepenthes, which we will talk a little bit about, need that cool mist. And even in a house, if you're keeping it 75, sometimes that's not enough.
Yeah, I don't think it'll work.
So that's the Helianthus, beautiful plant. You know, it might be something that we someday will carry, but it's a beautiful but own total different needs from all the other carnivorous plants we have up here. So, moving on, we next have the nepenthes. Now, this is another pitcher-like plant. These evolved on the other side of the world, in Asia.
Borneo, places like that, and from Malaysia, all of that. And these are epiphytes. So the way they grow, this is a beautifully grown one. The way they grow is just like orchids. They're up in the trees, and they send out, there's two kinds of pitchers. You have upper pitchers and lower pitchers. With nepenthes, the lower pitchers are usually much more colorful and larger. The upper pitchers will grow facing out. The lower pitchers will, some of them, not always, will grow facing in. They determine the reason that they do that is so the ones on the ground are more colorful, so it's an advertisement to crawling bugs to come on in there and they will get them. I've got one at home. I'm sorry I couldn't bring it in. You could probably drop a good sized mouse in there and it would eat it. The pitchers are huge. They get really big. And the thing with the nepenthes, they can range from pitchers that are only a couple of inches to some that actually, what they say, like the Raja.
Yeah,
you can drop a football inside one of those.
And
they get gigantic.
And if you want to talk about the man-eating plant, the flytrap won't eat any man or mammal, but the nepenthes will eat
That's what gave
mammals.
rise to that. They found birds in there and they found rats in there. And not that they attract them, but they have just fallen in, and the plant just, okay, and they'll take that out as well too.
And one thing really interesting about nepenthes compared to a lot of other carnivorous plants is they're pollinators now, and they're, the way they interact with animals. Like this Sarracenia, they live in nutrient-poor environments. So again, they have their traps to get nutrients and nitrogen and all sorts of nutrients from the insects and animals they eat. However, nepenthes, there's a certain nepenthes in I think it's in Borneo that's developed a relationship with shrews. The shrews are addicted to the nectar on the lip, and then lip the nectar and then defecate in the traps, giving that plant the nitrogen fix. So a little interesting
There's also
animal relationship.
There's one of those, like a porcelain crab. There's a crab that also lives down inside of there, and it has a symbiotic relationship with the plant. Because what it does is it lives down in the pitchers. It actually, when insects fall in there, the crabs will go through, break it up and eat it, which actually makes it easier for the pitcher plant to digest. And it's also feeding off of what its waste. So they have that. There's another variety. We have ant plants in here.
Oh, yeah.
There is one that literally the ants will make their home inside the tendrils of the plant. Any disturbance, anything coming to that, the ants will come out, attack this, and drive it off of there. When it's done, it goes back in. The way it works for that is some of them fall into the plant, so it's kind of a you're paying rent situation. So there's all kinds of interesting symbiotic relationships that these plants have with pollinators.
And I guess one more thing I want to talk about nepenthes is how they are epiphytes. Now, an epiphyte, again, is a plant that grows on top of another plant or a tree. These guys are not exactly stationary. They don't sit in cute little clumps or cute little rosettes. They are vines. And when they're in the right conditions, it takes a while, but they can grow yards or 15, 20 feet up. I mean, they will. They are just like the Helianthera. They live on higher mountains, higher altitudes, much cooler temps, and sometimes, again, that temperature is hard to regulate within the home. Lowland pitchers are lower elevation in the mountain. There's a lot more heat down there. They don't have that. Growing them outside is a little risky. I'd say there's a couple varieties like Alata and Maxima that you could maybe get away with, but there are, I think there's over 200 different species of Nepenthes, and very few of them are that conditioned to be able to tolerate that level of conditions.
And another caveat to growing these guys is like Maxim was saying, so you're growing these and you have these huge lower pitchers, and then as they start to get taller, the pitchers get smaller and smaller. You can propagate those if you cut them back, and it will push out new growth from the base. I've done that many times with mine. So that is something you can do, but when they're like this, it's not something you're gonna have to do right away. But it is one thing that can cure that, because in response to when you do that, and it's in the right growing conditions, it's in the right soil, right watering, all those, everything's lined up, all the stars, moon stars are all together, they will push out more growth from the base. And I have one plant, I'm sorry I couldn't bring it in, that is famous for doing that. So that's another thing to keep in mind with growing these guys.
Yeah, that is our Nepenthes. So does anyone have any questions on the Nepenthes? All right.
For the pitcher plants like the Nepenthes and the Sarracenia, when you water them, do you also water the pitcher?
No, you don't have to water the pitcher. I do water them from the top. When I grow them out, with my collection, I'll water them from a little from the top, and I always water them from the bottom, so it's getting an equal amount of water. But if you do fill these over, not only what will happen is they'll topple. So you don't want to do that. That is kind of what they'll do exactly, and that's a natural response. If you see these in the wild, they don't look anything like this. If you look them up on Google and you look at pitcher plants in the wild, you're only going to see one or two pitchers coming up. You'll see nothing like this. Same with fly traps, things like that. When you see them in the wild, you have to literally part and look down there because they are hidden to get down the tall grasses and everything. And that's what helps, because you have the spiders, ants, things like that, crawling insects on the ground. But yeah, they're designed to do that, but you do not want to fill up either one of these like that.
So next we're going to move on to our sticky traps, or the Drosera and the Pinguiculus have evolved pretty similarly. Now the Drosera, or the octopus plant, has quite the spread on it. Some grow in Madagascar. I think they're everywhere. So I think South America.
They're even here in California. I mean, there's all different kinds from temperate to tropical.
So there's ones that are cold tolerant and can totally die back to a rhizome in the winter, and then there's the tropical sundews. Now Drosera capensis, this one in particular, is going to be a warmer knee. It's a temperate sundew, so it doesn't like the cold, it doesn't like the frost. This is the one you often people start with. It has developed this really interesting mechanism where there's all these little nectar glands on its trichomes along the leaf that will trap the bug, and then slowly over time you'll see the plant either curl slightly around the bug or just keep the bug in place, and it will get its nitrogen by dissolving the insect on the leaf.
Yes, exactly. Another good one, and I know we can go over because there's so many different varieties of Drosera, it's amazing. This plant right here would be, if you're growing tropical plants, if you have a fungus gnat problem, this is probably going to be one of your best friends. This is Pinguicula, or the butterwort, and again, like the Drosera, there are so many different varieties. I believe these are the Mexican varieties.
Yeah, these are Mexican Pinguicula.
These are Mexican Pinguicula. These are fungus gnat magnets. So, and then you also have these beautiful flowers. They're right up there. Some of these are with African violets, and some of them get huge. Maxon had given me one of those, and I put it in the tank. Then I had a fungus gnat problem. Within 2 weeks, the fungus gnat problem was solved. they will literally fly to these and stick to them, and then the plant eats them, so you don't have to clean up anything.
And I actually used to keep one on my kitchen counter because I had a lot of fruit flies. Now I put them in a little glass terrarium on a piece of rock. So what's interesting about these guys is they don't have very aggressive root systems. They have tiny little fibrous roots that can pretty much latch to anything. They don't, not necessarily an epiphyte, but if you put them on lava rock or rock, they will attach to that. So they're a really interesting succulent-like carnivorous plant, and I'm hopefully going to be getting some more in for the shop. This for our class we'll discuss a little bit more afterwards. But they're like Rich said, amazing gnat catchers. You know, they love fruit flies, they like little insects, and they are the perfect little, you know, kind of bright kitchen windowsill plant. And so we had a question over here?
Yeah. Where is the, you know, like mouth mechanism on this one, or is it pretty similar to the octopus plant that you're describing where it kind
Oh, it's the leaf. It's the whole,
okay.
the leaf, the whole leaf there. If you can get up close and look at it, you can see there's all these tiny, minute little glands all over on the leaf.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that, I was talking about this earlier, I remembered this. In Europe, there are still farmers that will use this plant to make yogurt. With the clean leaves, mind you. But yeah, and the acid that is on those, they'll use it and they'll start to mix it in through their milk when they've milked the sheep and all of that. And it'll actually begin to curdle their milk. So either it's kind of a crude form of cheese or yogurt that they make out of that. So culinary art as well.
I didn't know that one up until now, so that's news to me. So yeah, there are, again, pinguiculas. We're going to start hopefully carrying them this, you know, fall, starting next spring. I did find a source for them, and we're going to be, you know, we're going to really kind of bring in a lot of carnivorous plants for our class we're having on the 27th. So I think I'll take a minute right now to discuss our next workshop. So if you're interested in attending, this is now your time to kind of see what you'll be working on. And that is going to be our, what I'm labeling as the bite-sized bog bowl. Now, like I said, these plants grow and they can't be inside forever, but this is a good way to at least learn your carnivorous plants. I'd say you have like a year of display with this arrangement. But what we're going to be doing is making a little bog as well as a carnivorous plant garden. So if you attend this class, you're going to be able to get a Sarracenia, a Drosera, as well as one of our Venus flytraps. And we'll show you a couple little companion plants like the Cryptanthus that does really well, and the Selaginella, which is a little tropical fern. So it's going to be a really fun activity on how to, you know, we'll be discussing a lot of what we're doing in the class tonight, but you also get a hands-on
to plant these guys. And the one thing, I'm glad you brought up, companion plants. I have done this. Please learn from my mistake. Never, ever, ever use Scotch or Irish moss. Now, it will grow beautifully in there. So beautifully, it'll choke out the plants. So even with the Sarracenias, like these guys, don't do it. Trust me, I learned this the hard way. Fly traps, everything, because the moss, these plants will grow at a pretty good rate. Unfortunately, the moss grows even better, and it will literally jump right over and suffocate them. So if you really don't want to put moss in there, sphagnum, which is what this is beautifully planted up in right here, is what you'd want to use. And even still, you want to trim that back every now and then, but it's more club shaped. So I'm glad you brought that up.
And what's
No
nice,
Scotch Irish moss.
what's nice about a sphagnum moss itself is since it is always so moist, it does retain moisture into the pot.
Exactly.
So, you know, if you forget a watering, sometimes that sphagnum moss will stay wet for that extra day just to keep the soil level moist.
And one more thing, this is where you get peat from. Sphagnum, when it starts to decompose, is what peat is. So peat moss, this is what it looks like when it's alive. It's sphagnum. So this is why a lot of times if you look at pictures of carnivorous plants growing in the wild, especially Purpurea, Sarracenia, Purpurea venosa, those varieties, even some of the fly traps, not always the fly traps, but they will always, there are some of these that will actually, what's really cool is if you've seen pictures of the Purpureas growing in the wild in this, the moss almost a guaranteed kill when you have insects walking through there because they just fall right down in there. But it's a symbiotic relationship it has with moss. That's the benefit.
So I guess the last thing we could talk a little bit about is the soil these plants need before we forget. So the Sarracenia, the fly traps, and the Drosera, I personally at home use a combination of 50% peat and 50% coarse river sand. Now you could also use 50% peat and chunky perlite. I use river sand just because its longevity is a little bit better than the perlite. It doesn't float to the top. It's usually kind of integrated well throughout the soil. Sometimes harder to find. Usually you can get it from like a rock yard.
Actually, Home Depot, you can get it. Like even playground sand, you just want to wash it. Now, when we're saying river sand, and I do agree, I've used perlite, but Maxon, I agree with his more. I've had better luck. Situation had it where perlite was all it was had on hand. I used it. It still works. It does. But sand, I believe, is closer to what they have in their natural environment. So anytime you're growing a plant, if you can replicate, especially plants like these, you can replicate what they're getting in the natural environment. That is just one more point in your favor. So I would highly recommend the sand. I really would.
And as for plants like the Nepenthes and even the Helianthera and well, the Pinguiculas do pretty well in sand and peat as well.
Yeah.
But Nepenthes especially, or the Helianthera, want a live sphagnum or the beige shredded sphagnum and perlite mix. So again, you kind of want to replicate what would be growing on the side of a tree trunk. So you want a really barky mix, organic mix, so you could even throw in some orchid bark, but sphagnum, moss, and perlite would be the ideal combination for that.
Anybody have any more questions?
I do have
Yes.
a question.
Sure.
Should I go first? Sorry. I just
Go
want to
for
go
it.
to the fly traps.
Uh-huh.
Because I have mine inside and it's not doing terrible, it's not doing great.
Get it
If
outside.
I were to put it outside, is there anything special I should do to keep the humidity up? I just feel like it's so dry.
Actually, it just, you constantly have it sitting. How big is it, like a 4-inch container that it's in?
Yes.
Have it always sitting in just slightly under an inch of water.
Okay.
Always. And they will tolerate it. They really will.
Okay.
I know, I get that, and I understand with people because it is so brutally hot, and then you hear high humidity and all that.
Yeah.
They really can't handle it. I've got mine out in a greenhouse. I'll use that very loosely. He's been out in there. It can sometimes be the gateway to hell out there. It can get like 110 degrees.
Uh-huh.
It's a smaller greenhouse. I'm going to get a larger one. Going to be much happier. The sun blasts those at 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon,
Okay.
and they're fine. They will take it, but they're also, I mean, I've got them in pots this big, and they're full, but they're sitting in like 3 inches of water.
Okay.
But they'll take it. You will see burn on them.
Yeah.
But you can't, if like I was saying, it goes back to that, if you deprive them of that light, then already it starts to go against them. They can take it, believe it or not, they really can. You just can't let them dry out.
And one trick to adapting the fly traps into an outdoor environment is starting earlier in the spring. Now, if you get this nice commercially grown, store-grown fly trap, it's been usually cultivated in a greenhouse. Now, if you get a nice 75-degree happy plant that's been conditioned with those temperatures, it's not going to like 108-degree Northern California sun. So what you're going to want to do is acclimate it in the spring. And again, you'll see them, especially in winter, they're going to be losing a lot more traps. They're not going to be quite as full as this. By the time, I'd say what, April and May come around, that's when you're going to be acclimating into the summer months. You can't just throw them outside. You're going to want to start in the spring. Kind of like how you plant a lot of your spring vegetables or spring plants, you want to do it during a season where it doesn't scorch them right away.
And one trick I will pass on to you guys, and I've learned this. Here's the thing with carnivorous plants, you'll always get a bloom first, Sarracenias and the fly traps. You'll see this weak growth, and then the flowers start to come up. On the fly traps, the flowers are not amazing. You're not missing out anything. The Sarracenias can be beautiful when they bloom. The only thing is that they bloom first so they don't eat their pollinators. It's not unusual to see, I've had, like I said, those big pots of fly traps, and they'll still continue to set up flowers. If you cut those flowers off, it actually speeds the growth up. So you can cut those flowers off, and you want to wait, because when these are coming up, it looks like an asparagus spear coming up. When the flower is coming up, it'll look rounded. So if I'm not sure, I always wait till it's up higher, and then you can definitely tell it's a bud. When you cut those flowers off, the growth accelerates, because what you're doing is taking all that energy that's being sent into that flower, and you're taking that off and now freeze it up so it can produce pitchers instead, or traps. And you can get amazingly large plants from doing that because it's taking that out of the way, it's taking the stress off the plant with blooming. So I highly recommend it. You'll have good luck.
Now for the pinguiculas, these ones are kind of like African violets almost. A lot of people even grow them for their cute little flowers. Since they're just absorbing leaves, again, you can cut them off. I always keep pinguicula flowers.
I do too.
They're adorable.
Yeah,
They're,
exactly.
Pretty little
They're
puffy
cute.
purple. Some look like, I think they have some that look like little rabbit faces and some that look like dancing ladies. I wouldn't cut the flowers off these guys. Now, one I would definitely cut flowers off of, unless you want a whole mat of them, is the Drosera capensis. Because I used to have this one bloom, and then the next year I'd find 80 little Drosera all over my pitcher plant bases, and they grow
Everywhere.
like weeds. In the floor, the cracks of my greenhouse, and just the little nitty gritty wet corners, they will become a weed. And you know, if you want a whole farm of them, maybe that's for you, but this is one that seeds aggressively.
And the other one, I would say, and I'm speaking from experience, Nepenthes flowers, even though they're very showy, they come out in this big, large panicle. Unless you're really fond of the smell of a wet dog, I would cut them off, because that is exactly what they smell like.
And then their pollen's really messy.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
And again, it just puts all that energy right back in there. But the smell alone merits cutting them. And just a heads up, Flavas have a tendency to smell like cat spray. There are some that will actually smell like Kool-Aid. I think it's rubra.
He thinks flowers smell like cat piss. I think they smell a little bit more like Hubba Bubba bubble gum. So I guess it's to the nose.
Okay.
But yeah, some are very sweet, nice fragrances, and like you said, he warned me, some smell like piss. So maybe my nose is just not adept. But yeah. So do we have any other questions at all? Yep.
Question about providing some heat source for the lowland Nepenthes. So, do you recommend a mild heat lamp from the top, or like a heat pad to the side of a terrarium?
Well, if you're growing them in a terrarium, I'd say honestly, one way that I've created tons of humidity is got a big tank, put about 2 inches of water, and then a heat pad at the base of the tank. You get a lot of heat out of that. Sometimes heat on the glass can just bake them. Now, if you keep the water in there or you keep sphagnum moss at the base, it's great, just to warm them up. Also, the lowland Nepenthes, as long as they stick around, I think, what do you think their tolerance is? 82, 75?
Yeah.
They just don't want to get cold. They're pretty hardy. Now, you have to look at varieties. Some Nepenthes are a lot sturdier than others if you want to get into some of the really interesting...
and very expensive.
And very expensive.
They can be extremely expensive. I mean, jaw-droppingly expensive.
Yeah. That's true.
And I was going to say, well, another thing is what you want to do is like say, okay, I'm going to get this plant, I'm going to put it in a terrarium. It's not going to stay this size, and you'd be amazed when they are happy how quickly some of these guys can start growing. So what I would really recommend, if you're going to grow them in a tank, I would try to get something like what they call a show tank, where you've got the height and the width as well, because you want to be able to accommodate that as it's growing. Because like I said, it's a vining plant. So the last thing you want to do is have that thing just doing great going up, and then it's hitting the top of that glass, and then it starts to go downhill from there. Or if you have the lights on top of it, as we've learned with my philodendrons and anthuriums, too much light actually can really start to burn them. So you just want to make sure that, allow room for growth.
And I ended up the first plant I collected was Nepenthes, and it started off with a couple fish tanks, and then a long shelf with a humidifier, and then I ended up with a 6-foot by 8-foot greenhouse.
It gets out of control.
And then that grew out of control, and I got a 16 by 32 foot greenhouse, and then I was like, these are too big and getting bigger and bigger, so I ended up donating some of them to conservatories. So they do just continue to grow and grow and grow, and that's just something you have to remember. You could always make a cutting of your plant, but if you don't have the conditions, you might have to make new ones. So just like us, the plants grow and they change and they evolve, so we got to be mindful and lean towards their needs.
Okay, so we're coming up on the close of anything, so are there any more questions or anything? We got about 5 more minutes. Is there anything else? Open floor? No?
All right.
All right.
Oh, and as Jonathan reminded me, for the rest of this month, on the 27th, we are having our Swig and Dig workshop. So it is $100 if you're not drinking and having snacks. It is $110 if you are drinking and having snacks. And you, like I mentioned earlier, are going to be making this bog bowl. At that event, we're going to actually be having, once again, 25% off the whole store. And I think we're going to be, I know I'm going to be bringing a lot of carnivores for that class, if you're looking for some carnivores.
And I've seen a preview of it. You want to be there for it.
I'm going to be releasing a lot more then. And I think we're also going to be trying to have a special table of event purchasers and people who attend will have a 40% off table as well. And that's going to be, Richard and I are going to be deciding what we're going to put on that. And maybe there'll be some carnivores on that as well. Now, following the next month, September, that's coming right around the corner, we're having a tent sale on September 4th from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's going to be all of our outdoor plants and pots on the right side of the tent. Lots of clearance options. On the 22nd, we're going to be having a free succulent Zoom workshop. So if you want to come back and sit down in our audience, we're going to be talking all things succulents and the do's and don'ts of them. And on the 24th, I'm going to be teaching a Swig and Dig paint night. So you're not going to actually be touching soil, but we're going to be painting all the pretty little plants we have in the shop for once. So that's going to be pretty much all of it. And for that monthly discount next month, it's going to be buy 3 succulents, get the 4th free, and our spin the wheel will be back. So yeah, come in next month. Come in the shop, and we are happy to help you and see you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.